We'll start with you, Anna. You in our upper left-hand square. Tell us how your week was and how you're doing. Anna, you're muted.
I'm not now. My week was great. I got great news. I am a CASA, and my little 3-year-old CASA, instead of us having to wait until May to have a final hearing on his disposition in terms of his grandparents being able to adopt him, they moved us up to February. So I'm really excited about that, and I hope that all goes well. They have postponed this 3 times. And the grandparents are just they're extremely nervous, but they don't have any reason to be, but they just want it to be over with. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'm hoping that the judge rules in our favor for him to be able to be adopted by his grandparents.
Wonderful, wonderful.
What is the
Laura and I
CASA?
had an exciting week. I was told some of you earlier before we started that Laura had severe chest pains that lasted about 3 minutes, and we spent Tuesday afternoon and evening in the hospital, but her heart is cleared, so we're hoping it's something else, acid reflux or something. But at any rate, her family has a history of heart disease, especially her dad, and so that's why we went in. But anyway, much better. But we got our COVID shots on Wednesday, so we're at 4 weeks or 8 weeks away from being street legal. So we'll see. Anyway, Jerry, how about you? How did your week go?
I'm fine, thank you very much. I have an appointment to get the vaccine this Friday through Baylor. I'm scared to death, but I'm gonna be brave and go do it. Yeah, all these stories about all these reactions, scare me, but it's better than not having it.
Yes, I hope it goes well for you. Laura, how are you and Ray doing?
We're doing okay. I've got 2 things to share with you. First of all, a lot of y'all know that my sister adopted 2 Chinese girls in 92 and 94. Well, the one that she got in 92, Andrea, let us know this week that she is pregnant. And so we are just on top of the world. When the baby comes, they will have been married about 4 years. So we're real happy about that. And then on Friday, I guess I needed some excitement. I was putting on my makeup, and all of a sudden I felt like I needed to spit, and I spit into a napkin, and I looked at it, and all this blood had come out of my mouth. And I thought, now this isn't normal. And so I went and got Ray and talked to him a second. I said, oh, Ray, I'm going to call Dr. Joe and just see, I need to go to the emergency room. And I told them that I had coughed it up, which I think makes a big difference, because I think if you cough it, it's coming from the lungs. But anyway, he said, yeah, get there immediately. We got there at about 11:30, and we didn't have the luck you 2 had in emergency room. It was over after 3 o'clock when I finally got to see a doctor. It was completely full. This is the Richardson Methodist, right on George Bush there in Renner. And they gave me a chest exam, chest x-ray. They did labs. That's one other thing they did. EKG. They couldn't figure anything out. They were trying to get a hold of a gastroenterologist and never did. And so I left with instructions that I was to call the one they told me, which is just right there too, on Monday, and get an appointment and find out if they can figure out what caused that. But it was kind of weird, real weird.
It is. Keep us.
And I even took the clinics with me to show them how much blood actually came out of my mouth, so they could see that there was something going on there.
Well, keep us posted on that, Laura.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Joyce, how are you and Ken doing?
We're doing okay. Ken called his doctor, and he's getting another cortisone shot in his back. That seems to be the only thing to help. He's in quite a bit of pain. I started Nutrisystem yesterday, and that is I was not doing well yesterday. I was having the shakes, and I don't know if I'm not doing it properly, because the first week you can't have any fruit. So anyway, I need to call. They have counselors all the time you can call, and I need to see if I'm doing something wrong. Evidently, I'm not getting enough protein. So anyway.
Well, okay. And Ken's doing all right?
Yes.
Very good. Very good. Okay, how are you and Jim doing?
You're doing well. I'm ready for some warm weather.
Yes, yesterday kind of spoiled us a little bit. It sure did.
Yeah.
Sure did. Brian, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. No news.
Okay, well, good for you. And Linda, how about you?
I'm doing well.
Good, very good,
Yeah.
very good.
Work's busy.
Okay, Tracy, how about you?
Same thing. Had a good week. Just working from home. Not much new to report.
Okay, Brad, how about you and Kenda? How are you guys doing in your family?
Yeah, we're doing fine. Kenda actually interviewed for a new hospice job this week, so maybe we'll find out next week if that comes through. So she's optimistic about that.
And for those of you that have joined since we talked about it earlier, Brad is doing some writing for Mark Wingfield. So if you'll take a look at that about some military bases renaming. So take a look at that.
Yeah.
Travis and Patty, how are you guys doing?
Good.
Yeah, we're doing well.
Very good, very good. Bonnie, how about you and Robert?
We're still here. We're good. Just, I'm envious of people that have gotten your shot. We haven't moved up the list, but anyway, we're still good.
Well, I hope it gets there soon. Joe, how are you doing?
I am doing well, Dennis, and hope to have some news on the job front soon, but I don't want to jinx anything. So
Yeah, here you go.
stay tuned for next week, maybe.
You got it. You got it. I want you and Brad to get to know each other at some point here, and we'll do that offline. But that sounds good, Joe. Don and Barbara, how are you guys doing? We can hear you this week. Don, are you there?
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Good,
Doing well.
good.
Thank you so much.
Well, it's good to hear you. I still would recommend you get your grandchildren to come in and do some IT work for you there and turn up that volume. But it's good to hear you.
All right. Thank you.
Great, great. Alice, how are you doing? Is this your next week? Are you going to be gone to Houston?
That's been set back. Sally had surgery on Wednesday, and it ended up that she had a clot that had formed around the surgical area. So she was in extreme pain. She's been in the hospital. She should get out today. So we'll have to set Houston back.
Okay, well, keep us posted.
I've seen enough of Baylor for a while.
I bet you have. Well, how are you doing, Alice? You do everything for everyone else. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I got my shot this week.
Good.
And
good.
so I feel like that's something taken care of. And other than that, I'm doing well. Just
Good.
tired of Baylor.
Good. Good. Nate, can you talk? How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I've just been I've just been working. Thank God I finally found a job that's a bit closer to my house versus going to South Lake. And me and my family are doing good. We just did our last wrap ups and stuff with our mom and everything. And I just took a couple of pendants that I found on Amazon over there to my aunt's house. So that way me and my sister can have some of the remains and all that good stuff.
Well,
But I do want to say that that Michael, I do appreciate the arrangement that you guys set up for us, and I know my family and them loved it and everything. I still have it, and also I would like to I want to thank you again, Dennis. With coming up over there to the service, at least on behalf of Wilshire.
yeah. Well, I was glad to be there, Nate. And I tell you, I'm looking at 3 of you here on the screen who've lost mothers, and I'm so sorry for that.
Huh.
Well,
Thanks so much.
yeah. Kelly, how are you doing? How are you and your family doing?
We're fine. We're
Yeah.
great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sandra, how about you?
Doing fine. Nothing new.
I like it. And Lisa and Ron, how are you guys doing? Whoops, I just lost Lisa and Ron. Okay, maybe it was something I said. Okay, they'll probably join us here in a minute. If there's anyone else have anything to add, I'm going to mute everyone, and then if not, and give it to Brad. So Brad, you've got it until about 10:45 or 10:40, whenever you finish. And then if you'll unmute yourself. So here comes Carolyn Strickland. Okay, real quickly, Carolyn, how are you doing? We're about to start the lesson here, but how are you doing? Carolyn, can you talk? Carolyn, you're muted. Now.
Okay, now I can. I'm just coming in, getting everything set up. Hello.
Are you doing okay?
Yes, I am. I'm doing great.
Very good. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to mute everyone, and then Brad, it's all yours.
Awesome. All right. Well, good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be back with you. I'm Brad Russell, if you haven't been with us before, but I love teaching this class. We had a great conversation last week. I really appreciate how engaged you guys get. So today we're going to talk about 3 stories that are gathered around this theme of scandalous people. Sounds like a Netflix series or something, right? It's a scandal. So we'll start off with John 8, which is the story commonly titled "The Woman Caught in Adultery," which frankly I think is kind of a bad subtitle because I'm not sure that's the major topic that's going on, but we'll talk about that. Then we'll do the Luke 19 story of Zacchaeus, obviously very well-known story. And then following that, there's a lesser known parable called the parable of the 10 pounds. I don't know that we'll spend a lot of time with that. I tend to be an overachiever, but we'll see if we have time for that. When you think about it, all these stories involve sex, money, power. Even more importantly, they are profound stories about justice and about mercy and redemption. So it's probably no wonder that we love these stories so much. So we'll jump into the first one, John 8, 2 through 11 in just a minute. But let me set a little context with what's going on in John chapter 7. And you can look at the text if you want to, while I do a kind of a brief overview. So, the story about the woman caught in adultery that we'll touch on in a moment really occurs within the context of kind of the growing ministry of Jesus. Jesus, he's been teaching in the temple at Jerusalem that he's winning over the crowds. He's growing in popularity, that people are starting to consider whether he actually is the Messiah. Obviously, it's very disturbing to the religious leaders. So the Pharisees and the chief priests, they send the temple police to try to arrest him. But the police are conflicted because on the one hand, they're very impressed with Jesus' teaching themselves. And they're also conflicted because the crowd is really turning in his favor. And so they don't arrest him and they go back to the leadership who demands to know why they didn't arrest him. And they basically say, have you heard this guy? Because he's really pretty good and people like him. And basically the leaders say, yeah, but the crowd, they're all idiots, right? They don't know the law like we do. And then Nicodemus steps up. And of course, we recognize Nicodemus as the one who previously has gone to Jesus at night, seeking to understand. And there's that whole wonderful conversation about how can a man be born again, after he's been born from his mother's womb. But he steps up to say, maybe in the name of fairness, we ought to actually give Jesus a fair hearing before we start judging him and condemning him. Nah, the religious leaders say, and basically they attack Nicodemus with what we would call like an ad hominem argument, right? So they say, what are you, from Galilee? Right? So they accuse him of like some kind of clan loyalty or prejudice rather than dealing with the validity of the merits of his argument that fairness would dictate actually listening to Jesus and giving him a fair shake. So that's kind of the context. So with that kind of foundation being laid, would somebody volunteer to read John 8, 2 through 6? All right, Brian.
Let me unmute. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Keep
All
going.
right, great. So, we've all heard this story, I'm sure many times. It's interesting to me to kind of reflect on these opening events from a variety of perspectives, right? So the text is kind of preoccupied with the Pharisees' perspective, right? They're taking these actions and their motives are kind of explained in the text. Obviously, you could think of these events from the woman's perspective, which is never really offered, right? What was it like for her? You can think of it from Jesus's perspective. Certainly, he's the target of this activity. And then you could also think of it from the perspective of the hearing crowd, of the observing crowd, right? Which is a mixture of both his disciples and not yet disciples kinds of people. So let's just start with a baseline of kind of the Pharisees' perspective. What is going on here? What's really going on with what's happening?
I kind of think they wanted to test Jesus to see what he would do about this. They knew what the law was, and I think it was like they were trying to test Jesus on a point of order or a point of law, I guess.
Okay, all right, Dennis. Yeah, so we know that on multiple occasions, Jesus endured these public setups, right? These ambushes where his opponents were trying to discredit him and to create kind of a narrative that would justify them getting rid of him, right? Good. So what do you think they expected to happen? Like the test, Dennis, that you described, like what were the possible outcomes?
If he lets her go, then they say he doesn't follow the law. If he says stone her, then he has no mercy. So kind of a no-win situation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Why would it be? Let's talk about your last observation. So if he says stone her, if he agrees with them, then he has no mercy. Why would that be important to the ministry of Jesus?
Because that would have been counter to everything that happened up to this point. For him, for the people that were following him, they were following because he was healing, feeding, caring for the sick, raising the dead, and that would have been out of order, out of the norm for him.
Yeah. So their little test that they came up with here is really trying to stretch the outer limit of grace, right? So it's like, okay, Jesus, how far will you go, right? Knowing that there's a lot at stake when you start forgiving and showing mercy to people that no one else wants to show mercy to.
It seems like at this point they were beginning, if not deeper into just beginning, to view him as a threat to their way of doing things. And this, if they could get him to agree that she should be stoned, this might neutralize that threat.
Okay. Yeah, there are bigger issues here than just the woman and abstract conceptions of forgiveness and mercy. There are social political, right, forces at work here. What else would you add just about kind of back to my original question, what's really going on with the test, with the strategy? Okay, well, so the religious leaders, obviously they represent more than just religion, right? I mean, these are, first of all, they're men, right? So there is a sense in which they represent not just religion, but they really represent patriarchy, right? They represent kind of male dominance. I think many of you have studied this story before. So what's the big glaring problem with their strategy?
Where was
Oh,
the
she
next-
didn't commit adultery by herself. I'm sorry.
Exactly.
Oh.
Exactly. She didn't commit adultery by herself. The man has not been brought forward as guilty, when in fact the law that they refer to references both in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. The law called for actually the stoning of both the man and the woman in the original giving of the law. So the scriptures are very clear. So in Leviticus 20:10, the scripture says, if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. Harsh, but equitable, right? Similarly, in Deuteronomy 22:22, and this is within the context of a bunch of kind of brutal legal regulations for sexual relations. It says, if a man is caught lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman as well as the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. So historically, it's really unclear whether this was ever actually practiced. But according to strict interpretation of the law, actually both of them were required to be found guilty and to be punished. So it's very clear that what we have going on here, in addition to religious authority, we have, very clear misogyny, right? We have hypocrisy and the double standard of holding a woman guilty while a man is kept faultless. And so, of course, Jesus sees all this. What's the other issue that's problematic about the way they're using this woman? Obviously, I'm kind of fishing here, but
well, they're publicly humiliating her.
And I think they're doing this for this. It's easy to be against something that you don't do, and so to me, this was they were trying to kind of, pump their own chests up about how much better they were. This person was caught in adultery. Not us, but this one was, to be made an example of.
Right. Yeah, if you pull back from a second, they're really objectifying her. In the same way that, she likely was objectified in the experience of adultery, right? They don't have any interest in her redemption. They don't have any interest in her dignity as a person. In fact, they're quite willing to exploit her as an object for no other reason but then to gain political advantage, right? So for me, the real theme of this story is not what the woman did. It's what these horrendous religious leaders are doing. She's already broken. She's already shamed. She already has to deal at a very personal level with the reality of what she's done and the effect on herself and on her family. And they just seize on that. To me, the most morally reprehensible behaviors are those, not that we personally do, but when people take vulnerable people, right, and then they use them and discard them, for their own personal advantage. So, I think to get the depth of the depravity of the story, it's not to be preoccupied necessarily with the sex. It's the power, right? That the real problem here, as Jesus sees it for what it is, it's the abuse of power, right? And so if there's a scarlet A involved in this story, the A is not necessarily for adultery. It's for abuse of power. So let's talk about this in our modern day application. So when you think about this story in the various aspects of it, what comes to mind for you in the world we live in today, where these kinds of moral / ethical issues kind of show themselves.
I may be the only one thinking this, but I'm thinking a lot of these hedge funds that short companies kind of got a little turnabout as fair play this week. And that's, I know a lot of people lost money, but it just seems like that power that they had to do that can really crush some companies, and some companies need to be crushed. I mean, but so it just seems like they abuse their power in some of that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, there's oftentimes a hypocrisy, right? And among those who have power, you know, they'll do everything they can, you know, to try to keep it, even though, you know, they wield their power unjustly, you know. Yeah, good point.
What
else
about
comes-
payday lending companies? You know, they think about that. You know, they've got these vulnerable people who need the money, and they say they're doing them a service, but they're charging them 300 and 400 and 500% interest. But they're making money off those poor people.
Absolutely.
That's an,
Yeah,
abuse,
in fact,
that's an abuse of power.
Absolutely. Yeah, they are. And actually that's relevant to Zacchaeus too, the next story, right? But absolutely, yeah, exploiting people, abusing your power, and yeah. Any other things come to mind?
Hiring undocumented people and paying them less than they would make if they were actually documented. And you know you can do it because they're not going to say anything.
Yeah, really good point. You know, I once upon a time, I was pastor of a rural South Texas church where chicken farming was a major part of the economy. And a number of my deacons hired undocumented workers to work in the chicken farms. And I was having conversations with them, you know, and just to hear their rationale, you know, I've heard it, you know, well, their life here is better than it was for them in Mexico, and you know, and yet they'll never have health care, and kids can't go to college, you know, and they're getting respiratory diseases, and you know, so yeah, you're exactly right. But then, and all the while feeling like they were good people, and you know, deacons in the church and upstanding people, while they were exploiting the labor of those immigrants. Yep.
Brad, one more thing before we leave this story, we heard this about 6 years ago from Carrie McDougall, when Jesus stooped down on the ground and started writing. You know, we don't know what he said. Well, we were studying the Old Testament during that time, and he referred to this verse, and we were studying about Rahab and how she helped the spies, etc. And they said that the Jews left from the oldest to the youngest. And wouldn't it have been interesting had Jesus written on the ground, Rahab the harlot, and then all of the Jewish men, the Pharisees, left.
That's a great example. In fact, I'm gonna talk about that in just a second when we read the next part of the passage. But yeah, it's whatever he wrote, it was truth, and it confronted them, and yeah, it was very powerful. Well, let's move on to hear these next verses, and then we'll kind of explore some ideas around that. So would someone read verse 7 through 11 then?
When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again, he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go on your way, and from now on, do not sin again.
All right, very good. So let's pick up on what Dennis was just introducing, this mysterious thing about Jesus writing in the dirt. So I love that, Dennis. In fact, I've never heard that approach that way, about perhaps he was reminding them of the role of Rahab, the harlot, in their history and the lineage of Jesus, and in all of that. That would certainly be shameful to them. Any other theories do you have about what Jesus might have been doing, or have you ever heard this taught other ways?
Well, there's a note in the NRSV that says other ancient authorities add the sins of each of them after wrote on the ground.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, John. It's John 8:8 is there, and so there were some manuscripts that tried to suggest that what he was writing was that he was writing their own sins, right? And so he was kind of confronting them that way. Some have speculated that maybe he was writing their names, like he was making it personal, like, I know you, right? And that would have been enough. Some have speculated maybe he wrote, where's the man, right? Or both should be stoned, or some reference to the law that they were breaking. There is one other common kind of explanation that comes up, and this takes a little bit of interpretive complexity, but there are a number of commentators who see suggested here a reference to a passage out of Jeremiah 17:13, which reads like this: Lord, hope of Israel, those who leave you will be shamed. People who quit following the Lord will be like a name written in the dust because they have left the Lord, the spring of living water. Now, there's a couple of reasons some commentators try to connect that Old Testament passage with this experience. First of all, in John 7, Jesus does use the come to the spring of living water message. So there's a near proximity of that concept. Then there's the notion of shaming, right? They're trying to shame the woman, where Jesus argues that, the shame is on you as well. And then the actual physical action of writing in the dust could be a way to kind of bring this passage to mind of the Pharisees who should know the law, and that as he writes in the dust, they would think of Jeremiah talking about people's names being written in the dust as an example of those who've left the Lord. So, who knows, honestly. We do know the net effect, obviously, is that it was a silent confrontation. It was, and I think that's really interesting that, this is a highly emotionally charged situation, really. Sexual infidelity and public shaming and the risk of life or death, and Jesus is not yelling at them. He's not going head to head with them. He's very quietly, calmly writing in the dirt, and they just all have to walk away. And then there's this closing of the passage, which feels really tender, as he looks at this woman and he says, who's left to condemn you? She's like, no one. And then he says, well, neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more. And I, obviously, I think this story is enduring and so beloved because Jesus offers this radical kind of forgiveness and welcome that even some of our worst deeds are not death sentences. They're just not. They're not with this God. Even if in the past, legally they were. Jesus is here to say that there's a new reign of God breaking into the world where the worst possible things that we could do are not death sentences for us. And so he lets her go and gives her a new lease on life. So one of the things I want us to think a little bit about this passage before we move on is How have you seen or heard this ending, this passage misused? Or how can this story be misused? Especially this notion that let him who is without sin be the first to cast a stone.
It's kind of like, well, we've all done it, so sinning is no big deal. I'll be forgiven. No problem.
Okay.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts?
There could be people who think they are without sin, so they would throw the stone. There are those people.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Sermon on the Mount teaching about, take the speck out of your own eye first, then you can judge your brother. Okay, fine, I'm clean, I'm good. I can see you crystal clear with perfect objectivity. And we've all known and met those people that were so certain of their righteousness, right? That they could be the voice of God for everyone else, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, and actually in recent years, there have been a number of leaders, celebrities, other people who've been caught in all kinds of misdeeds, and in popular culture, they will try to invoke this, you can't judge me, right? No one can judge me. No one's perfect. And even in press conferences, there have been examples of people trying to cite this, none of you are without sin, so you can't criticize me. So the story can get misused. It's kind of endorsing a kind of universal leniency. Like, you just can't take, social norms or morality seriously because everybody breaks them, right? And certainly that's not what Jesus is doing here. And in fact, what does Jesus do that helps us understand that even within the context of grace, righteousness is still important?
His request to her that she go and not sin again.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So it's that small little phrase, but it's so critical that Jesus is not saying that adultery is not sin, right? And so in that sense, he is fulfilling the law. He's saying, no, marital relationships are sacred. And yes, there is forgiveness for people who make this most horrendous and tragic mistake that causes suffering to the people around them. It's not unforgivable, but you do have to not do it. And in your new transformed life, you recommit yourself to fidelity. And so he simultaneously upholds God's expectation of faithfulness and fidelity, even while there's grace to begin again. So so that's really important. And so it really keeps us from misusing this as to kind of endorsing kind of a what one commentator said, a perverse use of this story to defend against any guilt, right? Okay, great. By the way, just as a footnote, and some of you may have seen footnotes in your Bible, this story, as beloved as it is, really is of dubious origin as far as the scriptures are concerned. It does not appear in the earliest manuscripts. It doesn't even appear in manuscripts until 900 AD.
Wow.
Yeah. So as beloved as it is, there's not a lot of textual support for this story in the earliest manuscripts. So also there were similar stories like this independent of the biblical narrative. A lot of commentators point to a story that was appended to the book of Daniel in the Septuagint, which is the first Greek translation of the Old Testament. And I won't go into in depth to it. You can look it up if you want to for further study. But there's a story known as Susanna and the Elders that was added to Daniel 13. And it's in the Catholic Apocrypha. And it's a similar story where a woman is false. In that story, she's falsely accused of adultery by two men who were lusting after her. And then there's a trial, and then Daniel kind of defends her, and ultimately he exposes the false accusation. But but it's got the same moral force of exposing male hypocrisy, who are trying to exploit a woman for their own advantage. So for your own further study, if you want to look at that, you can look up Susanna and the Elders and learn more about that. Okay, let's press on to Luke 19, the story of Zacchaeus. And I'm going to ask someone to read verses 2 through 7.
Man there was named Zacchaeus, and he was the chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, has he gone to the guest to be one who is a sinner?
Okay, thanks, Dennis. So like many of you probably, it's very difficult for me to hear this story read aloud and not have the song running through my head. And it's very problematic for careful interpretation. In fact, I once created a children's program in a church I led called Zach's Treehouse, right? The kids loved, but the whole program was built around this, this interchange. But this is not a cute story, right? And so, how might we consider Zacchaeus a scandalous person under this theme of scandalous people?
His job entailed bidding with foreigners, and it was a competitive bidding process. And what gave you competitive advantage was your willingness to exploit your fellow Jews and extort, essentially, the most, I don't know if extort's the right word, but you get the idea. It's something along those lines. The most possible money, because they were bidding for how much they were going to provide to the Roman government. And so there was competition. And then they got to, once they fulfilled their obligation to the Roman government, they got to keep whatever was left over for themselves. And it seems invariably they made themselves rich in the process.
Wow, Travis, you're amazingly informed about the art of being a tax collector.
Oh, what does that say about me?
No, that was a great explanation. Yeah, I mean, these guys were like considered leeches, right? They were just the most reviled, right? Because they were financially exploiting their own people and in league with, the devil, with Rome. Yeah, just bad dudes, right? Now, the fact that it's called a chief tax collector, actually, there's no real ancient references to this title of a chief. It probably suggests, just in the context of the story, the chief just means that he was really, really great at being bad. He was exceedingly nasty, right? He was exceedingly crooked. If he was going to write a book, it would be The Art of the Steal, right? And so here is Zacchaeus. Now, there's a lot of speculation often about, what must Zacchaeus's mental, emotional, spiritual state have been that would cause him to do the things he did that day, right? To want to see Jesus in the first place, to be frustrated because he couldn't visually see him, to run up the street, to climb a tree, which is kind of embarrassing for a grown man to do. We would, project. We don't really know The text doesn't give us, it's a pretty sparse text, like a lot of biblical stories. But certainly we could imagine that a man whose life was engaged in this kind of practice, somehow there was a readiness, right? We can only assume that somehow there was a readiness. Whether that readiness felt, well, let me just ask you, what might that of readiness to Jesus felt like for a person like this?
Maybe like somebody going to a AA meeting for the first time. They're ready they're ready for recovery.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. How else can you imagine he might feel?
I would imagine him to be a lonely person, considering his business and considering the crowd's reaction.
Yeah, good. Yeah, we'll talk about that reaction in just a minute, but I think you're right on. So you're spot on that there's a social isolation that's very much a part of the story of being outside the community.
He may have felt guilty about what he was doing and saw that this man was coming around, seemed like a straight shooter, and wanted to hear more.
Yeah. Certainly he had reason to feel guilty, to feel shame, to feel desperate. I see just in the energy, the frenetic activity of the crowd and a man running and climbing, just the physical exertion to me is suggestive of kind of a desperation, right? There's an energy inside this man that's driving him toward change. Whatever it feels like, whether it feels like anxiety or fear or shame or weariness or loneliness, I think we all know, right? that we're most open to change, moral transformation, when there's that kind of readiness, right? So something's going. So let's talk about the differences between Jesus's reaction to Zacchaeus in the crowd. How are their responses different?
Like 180 different. He treated him like he was special. Hey, I see you up in that tree. I'm coming to your house today.
Yeah.
And the crowd was not thinking of him in that way.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, this theme of scandalous people, it's not just the primary characters in the story that can be scandalous, right? The woman caught in adultery, really, a lot of people thought Jesus was scandalous, right? He was scandalous for forgiving her, right? And here, the crowd thinks it's scandalous for Jesus to go have lunch with this guy, right? So, scandal happens when the grace and mercy of God challenges, right, bigotry, and challenges power structures. In the first story, Jesus challenges the patriarchy, right? He's up against all the men, and here he dares to challenge the community's rejection of a man grounded in moral indignation, right? Grace is scandalous, isn't it? It's perfectly fine until Jesus wants to forgive your enemy. right? So, you know, we've heard that cliche about, you know, the, what is it? It's the enemy of my, or whoever is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
Yes.
But the same is true that whoever is the friend of my enemy is my enemy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this inherent scandal associated with Jesus's openness, right, to this man, where all the crowd feels is vindictiveness, right? And we can understand it, right? I mean, it's incredibly hard to offer mercy to our oppressors. Yeah.
I think it's interesting, Brad, that they said he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Like none of them are sinners.
Yeah. It's interesting. In the New Testament, oftentimes people are referred to as sinners as opposed to a sinner, a one who sins. And typically, when someone is referred to who was a sinner, they're referring to a class of people, right? So it's not just someone who has sinned, all of us who have, but if someone was positioned among the sinners, they were put in a folder of persona non grata, right? They were put outside the pale, right? They were condemned. They were people whose whole personhood was defined by their sins. Yeah, so when they say, "Oh, he was a sinner," that means that they had put him. He wasn't one of their own who'd broken a law of God. He was the one who'd been put outside the community among the sinners. Yeah. So yes, Laura. So I mean, they're revealing this kind of moral framework that's us and them, right? We're just people who occasionally sin, but that guy, he's completely corrupt through and through, right? And of course, that's not to go too far afield, but you know, that's what we see a lot today in the polarization, right, in American culture, in all the ways we see it, right? That people who disagree with us are demonized as enemies, and suddenly we're not just in civil disagreement, we're in war. And much has been written recently about the rhetoric of war that's been invoked by politicians in order to give their followers permission to suspend the ethical rules. In fact, I heard a really great interview with I think it was a communication specialist or rhetorical from A&M, NPR a week or two ago, and she's written a book recently about the language of war used in American politics, and how in real global wartime, a lot of times we suspend the ethical rules because there are mortal threats, right? And so we give nations permission to kill, right? And we take on permission to think of our enemies in terms less nuanced, right? And just see people as purely evil and purely good, right? And so when you start invoking that kind of language for domestic civil policy, right, then you start giving people permission to suspend the ethical rules, right? I don't have to respect you. I don't, you know, and so then it just becomes this horrible, you know, going down the rabbit hole. So I don't want to go that too far, but I think it is profound.
Haven't we learned that from singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers"?
Yes. All of that military imagery. Some came from the Crusades, some came from the Civil War in the Deep South. It's just incredibly problematic. it's so open to abuse. So we see, you know, this kind of thinking among the crowd, which is very binary, you know, it's very polarizing. And of course, Jesus, wants to cut through all of that by the gift of his friendship, the gift of his presence. That was always the way Jesus operated. Final question about Zacchaeus. Obviously, at the end of the story here, let's just, okay, so let's read, somebody read verses 8 through 10.
I got it. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost."
Okay, great. Well, we're out of time, so I'm not going to explore this very further. Obviously, this issue of restitution is unique to this story. We see it a couple of other times, but it's really important to the story in 2 senses. One, that it really demonstrates the power of Jesus to transform people. Now, this seems like the transformation happens lightning fast. It's like that. It doesn't really happen this way, in real life. And yet, that's the power of these succinct little stories: is that we see, this man who is so convicted and so willing to make restitution that actually his offer is quite extravagant. It goes way beyond the requirements of the law and the history of Jewish tradition, and it really validates the fundamental principle that true repentance bears fruit. Right?
Can I offer a quick observation on that?
Yeah.
It may have been also him trying to re-enter the Jewish community, because and I looked this up. I didn't just walk around knowing this, but when Nathan confronted David and told him about the man who stole from the shepherd or whatever, David said, before he realized that Nathan was talking about David said, burned with anger, and said he must repay 4-fold what he took from that man. And so this is a way of not only being extravagant, but calling back to King David and maybe saying, look, I'm ready to be a good Jew again.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great point, Travis. Yeah. Well, super. Well, it's been a great conversation. We always have to stop some point. So thank you guys again. And I think we have a closing prayer, Dennis.
Yeah, we do. Thank you, Brad, very much for teaching these last 2 weeks. I want to, Ron and Lisa, you guys joined us as after my laptop died. How are you guys doing? You guys okay? Ron and Lisa, you guys there?
Yeah, I had to unmute. You hear us?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
okay. Wayne is still in the hospital. That's Ron's brother.
Oh.
Still on a ventilator. So it's been many days.
Well, so sorry.
He's really the main one, for prayer. And then there's his other brother, Garvin, who's fighting leukemia.
Okay.
So hold them up in prayer, and then hold Ron up in prayer, because he's feeling the burden.
I'm sure. Thank you for that.
What is his other brother's name?
Garvin.
Okay.
So thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. Good to see you guys both. Anyone else on this one? We'll close in prayer. Okay, Laura, here we go.
Okay.
Just a second. Here we go.
Gracious Father, thank you for being with us this morning. Thank you for the words that Brad has given to us, so that we may further understand you and your scriptures. I pray a prayer of thanks for each person that is represented here. We all have many prayers in our hearts, and I pray that you will hear us now. Please be with Carrie Donaldson, who is ill, and help her to recover from her sinus infection. I pray a prayer for Faye Larson. Please help her as she recovers, and as you help her to recover from her paralyzed vocal cords. I also pray that you will be with her as she takes care of Mark and her mother. Please be with Vicky Kahn Beasley as she continues to travel back from Florida. Give her traveling mercies. I also pray that you will be with Joanna Jones this morning as she is undergoing a kidney transplant. I pray that you will be with the doctors and guide their hands and help her to have a good and safe recovery. But also be with Bill, her husband. Please give him peace and comfort as he waits for Joanna to go through this surgery. Please be with Laura Snow. Please help her doctors to find out what is happening with her health so that they may come to resolution and that she may be a healthy person. Be with Ken. Please help him with his back pain. I pray that you will be with Joe as he seeks a job. Please help him. Please be with Alice and Sally after her surgery. Please be with the doctors as they continue to work with Sally and help her return to good health. I pray for Nate that you continue to hold him in your loving arms as he continues to grieve for the loss of his mother. We also pray for Ron's brother, Wayne, as he is still on a ventilator from COVID-19. I pray that you will help him return to health. Please be with Garvin. Please help him in his recovery from leukemia. And please be with Ron as he supports and helps each of his brothers. We thank you for this day. We thank you for this wonderful church. For it is in your name that we pray this prayer. Amen.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Hope everyone has a great week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Brad.
Have a good week.
Brad.
Thank you.
Brad, we want you back sometime. He's gone. Yes. Yes. Anna, so glad you're with us today.
Thank you. I'll see you next week.
Okay, great.
Okay, great.
I think Terry Wade is teaching next week. She's going to be in, I think. All right. Great to see everyone.
Thank you.
Hope you have a great
Bye,
one.
Linda.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So good to see you all.